Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Boost Your Value Proposition with the MBTI Step II Assessment. I am Larry Romero, Channel Marketing Manager at the Myers-Briggs Company, and I will be moderating today. The webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and at the end, your presenter, Yvonne, will be answering your questions. So throughout the webinar, simply submit them to me at any time using the question function. Please note, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending it out to you via email, as well as the link to the recording, or in addition to the recording link, we'll also be sending the slides, and we'll be doing this in the next couple of days. I am very pleased to welcome our expert, Yvonne Nelson-Reed, Associate Consultant with the Myers-Briggs Company. Beyond this, Yvonne is a depth psychologist, career coach, teacher, and writer. And with over 20 years of experience in working with and using the MBTI tool, we're all in for a great presentation today on how to boost your value proposition with the MBTI Step II assessment. Now, let's get started. Welcome, Yvonne. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Larry. Welcome, everyone. As Larry mentioned, do keep track of your questions, as I'll do my best to answer them at the end of the session. Let's begin with the objectives for this webinar. First, we will review the fundamentals of the MBTI framework, followed by a review of the MBTI Step II assessment, its value and implementation. And lastly, we will explore the ways that you can use the Step II for individual, team, and leadership development. As you know, we as practitioners offer so much more than a computer program spitting out a 4-letter personality type with a brief description. An interpretation session is vital to help your client better understand their mindset at the time of taking the assessment, what may have influenced their responses, and how they might use each preference on a daily basis. These knockoff programs cheapen the value of the MBTI and leave people thinking of it more as, say, a quiz-based game instead of the dynamic tool we all know it to be. Discovering our 4-letter personality preferences is just the tip of the iceberg. Learning how to apply it to our personal and professional lives is where the real value lies. There have been numerous articles and books written critiquing the MBTI. The critiques, however, are often based upon misinformation and misuse of the assessment. Clearly, the authors have never taken a certification program for the MBTI. Our challenge is to overcome these obstacles and exhibit the value within the MBTI framework for all of our clients. One way to do so is by introducing them to the MBTI Step II assessment. How might your clients benefit with a Step II feedback session? Well, the Step II provides a deeper understanding of how an individual experiences and expresses their type. It describes differences within same type preferences, allotting for an individualized type description, something that Myers recognized from the beginning, but was unable to determine without current technology. Some people believe that the type description must fit them 100%. The Step II may provide answers as to why some of those descriptions don't fit for them. It is not unusual for some people to be unsure as to which preference fits for them the best. They may have unclear preferences. The Step II may help clarify their best fit overall preference, or at least provide insight as to why that preference may be unclear for them. As with the Step I, the Step II may identify developmental opportunities. A feedback session is interactive. Stories and examples are shared by the client. A great deal of discussion takes place with the Step 2, which requires more time than a Step 1 feedback session. Not only will your clients benefit by the addition of a Step 2 interpretation, so will you. Once certified, most practitioners begin using the Step 1. By the time they feel comfortable moving into the Step 2 assessment, time may have passed by, leaving them feeling a bit intimidated and perhaps even overwhelmed. My hope is that this webinar will inspire you to take your practice to a deeper level. You can now offer your previous Step 1 customers another opportunity to understand personality type preferences and how the environment may influence them, expanding your existing customer base by offering more options. Many people are familiar with the Step 1, and as I mentioned before, some may be overly critical, often biased by misinformation or a simplistic understanding of the tool. You can stand out as a practitioner through offering the Step 2 assessment as a way of helping your clients explore and apply their type preferences at a deeper level. You will have more tools now to provide unique, in-depth workshops. Tailor your use of Step 2 results to meet the needs of your clients even better. The Step 2 will enhance what you may be offering already with the Step 1 through various applications. Let's start with a quick review of the fundamentals of the MBTI framework. This is information that you will already be familiar with. Jung-Myers personality theory is the new way to refer to the fundamental framework of the MBTI as described in the new MBTI manual for the global Step 1 and Step 2 assessments, released in 2018. The dynamic character of this theory is a central feature of the theory's explanatory power and sets this theory apart from other personality approaches. The way the preferences in each type combine their dynamic interaction is a unique feature of the Jung-Myers personality system. Let's review the MBTI framework. We know that it focuses on 4 pairs of opposites, referred to as preference pairs and not dichotomies, as many of us are familiar with from previous trainings. This is the familiar format for the 16 MBTI personality types. Many people don't seem to go beyond these 4-letter descriptions. The MBTI Step 2 assessment opens us to a deeper understanding of our preferences and how we might be different from others with similar type preferences overall. As you know, these do not represent 16 static boxes. Instead, think of them as a 16-room house. One room is your favorite, the one you are most comfortable in. However, you can visit the other rooms whenever you choose. I've described the basic framework as a review for the MBTI. Now let's take a closer look at the MBTI Step 2 assessment. When I give a feedback session with a client, individuals, or groups, for Step 1 verification of their best fit type, I always have them turn to their 2-page type description in their copy of the Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type booklet. I ask them to highlight in blue all of the statements that are true for them, then highlight in green all of those statements that don't fit. If they are unsure between 2 different types, I have them do this with both descriptions. Sometimes just seeing the amount of blue helps them to decide which type preference is the best fit for them. If they don't want to highlight, then I at least have them underline the statements that don't fit for them. Well, I also have them do this for the Step 2 feedback session. It is especially helpful to look at those descriptors that do not fit, as they may reflect the ways they differ from others of their type. The Step 2 is ideal for this purpose. What is the Step 2 assessment? I will provide you with a quick review, and then we will go into how we may apply it when working with customers. The new Global Step 2 assessment is based upon current research, 2018 data. It is available online only. Computer scoring is required for results. Results are not given to the client directly. A feedback session is required for your client to receive results. For those of you certified prior to April 2019, the assessment you will be familiar with is Form Q. It is still available. However, I encourage you to try out the new Global Step 2 assessment. More information on the global assessments can be found at the web address listed on this slide, the Myers-Briggs.com/MBTI Global Assessment. As you know, Step 1 produces a 4-letter type code. A variety of reports are available. However, all of the reports are the same for each type. You can produce Step 1 results from a Step 2 assessment. Step 2 provides the 4-letter type along with 20 facets. And I will be going into more depth on what I mean by facet. It is these facets that identify and describe within type differences, producing an individualized type. Well, let's look at what we mean by facets. First off, we are multifaceted. The MBTI Step 2 assessment identifies some of those facets, some of the aspects of the overall preference, but not all. The scores for the facets do not add up to the overall preference score. Secondly, the facets may describe how we are different from others with the same overall type preference. Facets are often reflect environmental influences. Third, facets may be on the opposite side of our overall preference, reflecting how we may express less preferred aspects of our personality. And lastly, remember that facets are still preferences. We can choose how we behave in any situation. As with the Step 1 preferences, based upon the descriptions and interactive feedback session, we decide whether that facet fits for us or not. Here are the facets. This is an example of what page 4 of the Step 2 interpretive report looks like. They are described in depth in the manual, user's guide, and the Understanding Your Step 2 Results booklet. There are 20 facets, each containing one pair of opposites. You can see where there are 5 facets per overall preference pair. How would we read these? For example, the first facet under extroversion introversion, we would read as facet initiating receiving. The next one beneath that would be read as expressive contained, and so on. And you can see the list of all 20 facets here, 5 per preference pair. Notice on this page that highlighted in blue, you see your Step 1 preferences. So in this case, for this person, their overall preference is for INFJ. The 20 facets are described in categories and are not referred to by their scores. The categories are in preference, mid-zone, out of preference. Facet descriptions depend upon your verified best fit step 1. For each facet, there is the potential for 6 different descriptions, so you can see how individualized this report becomes. It is these different descriptions that illustrate what makes you unique within your overall type preferences. Here's an example of a facets graph. This is for extroversion, introversion. Remember that a preference is broader than its facets. Your 5 facet scores do not add up to your step 1 preference score. Notice on this graph, highlighted in blue is your step 1 verified type preference. Everything in the blue section below is considered to be in preference. Everything in dark green is out of preference, meaning that it's on the opposite side of your overall preference. And the lighter green is the mid-zone. Note that facets are described by category and not by score. The vertical blue line shows your results dependent upon how you responded to the items on the assessment. You'll also notice a brief description is listed for each facet, defining them on this graph. On the same page in the report, beneath this graph, you will find each of your facets listed along with descriptions that are specific to that facet based on your overall type preference. Well, let's take a look at what these categories are. Let's begin by looking at what we mean by an in-preference facet. An in-preference facet has a score of 2 to 5 on the same side as the overall preference. Secondly, client typically agrees with the description. Occasionally, however, they will disagree. You will want to review descriptions then for mid-zone and out of preference facets to see if they fit better for your client. When you're reading the report during your session, it is read like this. You report in preference abstract. How does this fit with your understanding of yourself? Looking at mid-zone results. Mid-zone results have a score of 0 or 1 on either side of a preference pair. It's not necessarily, doesn't mean you're necessarily good at both, because remember that the assessment does not measure skill. So what reasons might you be in the mid-zone? Perhaps it's habitual, situational use of both, or maybe ambivalence on which one to use. How do you read the report with a mid-zone? An example would be, you report mid-zone, active, reflective. How does this fit with your understanding of yourself? Notice that both opposites are used when describing the mid-zone. The Jung-Myers theory proposes that people are born with a disposition to develop along certain typological lines. Thus, out-of-preference results are best explained as representing a compromise between a person's natural type and the demands of one's environment. The descriptors will read differently from someone who is in preference for that facet. A person who is out of preference on a facet likely expresses the favored facet pole in a somewhat different way than does a person who favors that same facet pole in preference. This may be due to the amount of energy available for that expression, Less energy is available for out-of-preference facets, resulting in a muted expression as compared to that facet when it is in preference. Score of 2 to 5 on the side opposite the overall preference. Second bullet, out-of-preference facets identify how you may be different from others with the same preference. May reflect long-standing behavioral habits. May result from individual development or training. And how would you read the report in this case? You report out of preference methodical. How does this fit with your understanding of yourself? Well, there are two different reports that you can purchase with the Step 2. You can get a brief profile or detailed interpretive reports. The profile report is only 5 pages. It is based on reported type results. There is no verified type option. You just get the scores and graphs with no interpretive information. The most appropriate use in this case would be for research. I recommend the interpretive report. You have a verified type option so that you can customize the report. This verified type changes the interpretation of the report, not the scores. If somebody changes their best fit Step 1, then you have the option to run a second report based upon that new verified type, and you can do that at one time with no extra charge. Well, what does the interpretive report for Step 2 contain? On the slide, you'll notice first bullet that it includes descriptors for each facet based on your verified type and category. You also get additional pages describing communication, conflict management, change management, decision-making styles, and how you can enhance them. You will also get a description of type dynamics, along with an individualized type and an overview of the results. The overview of the results comes in the form of interpreter summary. This is for your use, not to be given to the client. If you do end up giving it to the client, you will need to be prepared to explain it because it can be confusing. The interpretive report includes Step 1 results with a probability index, and that's a new term that we use with the global Step 2. You will get Step 2 facet results with scores, so that can be confusing for the client. The graph shows the average range of scores for that personality type. That's that shaded bar. The vertical line in the middle is the mean score. Bold numbers are your respondents' scores. Now, if you go down to the bottom of that slide on that interpreter summary report, you'll see where it says Polarity Index. I will describe more about that on the next slide. You will want to review the Polarity Index before ever giving your client the report. What is that Polarity Index? Well, it represents how consistently you responded to the items on each facet. There's a Polarity Index that has a score of 0 to 100. Now, most adults score between 50 to 65. Higher scores are common. Below 45 means that there are many facets in the mid-zone. That score below 45 could represent a possible invalid report, which is why it's necessary and important to check that before going over the report with your client. What reasons might there be for that score below 45? Perhaps they've developed a a mature situational use of that facet, or a lack of self-knowledge, maybe ambivalence, maybe when taking the assessment they misunderstood some of the items, or just randomly answered. If the polarity index is below 45, it's not necessarily indicative of a problem, so don't jump to conclusions. The client is likely able to explain why it was low. You can check with the client first before going through the report. Ask them what their frame of mind was like at the time they took the assessment. Then go through the report. Ask them if the report fits. If so, the report can be considered valid. If the characteristics don't fit, you can look at other descriptions for either side of the preference pair to see if either of those fit better. The facet poles are described in Preference and Midzone in the manual, the user's guide, and Understanding Your Step 2 Results booklet. Use these in a feedback session if someone questions their results. See if another description fits better for them. I always use the Understanding Your Step 2 Results booklet in any feedback session, whether I'm working with individuals or with groups. We've covered the first two objectives for this webinar. We've looked at the MBTI framework, as well as reviewed the Step 2 assessment. Now let's turn to how we might apply it. Remember, the MBTI report is not a measure of skill or ability. Like the Step 1, there are ethics to follow. The client receives interpretation results. It is not appropriate to just email or hand back a report. Agree ahead of time who will have access to the results. Remember that it is voluntary participation for teams and groups, and avoid stereotyping based on either type or facet preferences. So when would you use the Step 2? You can use it in any situation that you would use the Step 1. Keep in mind, however, that to take into consideration time, because that feedback session is twice as long or even longer when using the Step 2. And lastly, consider the client's needs and their purposes. In other words, is this the appropriate assessment to use? The Step 2 is a tool for discussion. Tailor it to your client's needs. The more personalized the session, the better. Listen and respond accordingly. Ask for examples. Your client will often share stories explaining how the facets fit for them. Here's a review on how to conduct a feedback session for individuals. Begin by checking the Polarity Index. If it's below 45, have a conversation prior to going through the session. You will then want to introduce or review Step 1 information because we need a verified Step 1 type. Before going any further in the report, you will want that verified Step 1 type, because that will change what the descriptions may be like for the Step 2. Once you have a verified Step 1 type, then go ahead and introduce the Step 2 approach. You can describe how to read those facet results in Preference, Midzone, Add a Preference. Briefly explain each facet and go over those results with your client. Then explain to them their Step 2 individualized type. This is the client's Step 2 name, and I will give you a couple examples of what that looks like. And then discuss relevant applications from the back of the report. Keep in mind there are several, and to go through all of them might be overwhelming for your client, I typically choose one in an area that they're most interested in working on. And then we will meet again at another time to go through the rest of the report. But that's between you and your client. Well, what kind of questions? So it's a feedback session. You're going to want that interactive process as you go through the feedback. What kind of questions do you ask? These are the kinds of questions. Do you agree with the description of your facet results? If so, how does this help you? How does it not help you? And then ask for examples. If it doesn't fit for you, do one of the other categories fit better for you? What may have influenced how you answered the items? When and how do you think out of preference facets developed for you? How do mid-zone and out of preference facets influence your use of this preference? And then look at how effectively they use those facets, or maybe if there are any developmental opportunities with them. The bottom line is that it will be your client that brings this information to you. And it is through the questions that you ask that help bring that out of your client, to help them to better understand their Step 2 results. Well, at the end of any Step 2 feedback session, it's important to revisit and go back to Step 1 results. These are the kinds of things to consider. Review the type description in Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type. The Step 2 may explain why some of that description does not fit for you. It also may separate natural dispositions from environmental learning. Does the Step 2 help you to verify your Step 1 results? So if someone was unclear prior, perhaps going through the Step 2, it will help them become more clear on their overall Step 1 results. How does knowing your Step 2 facets influence your understanding of your Step 1 type preferences? Remember that the Step 2 facets are just some aspects of each overall preference. Each preference is multifaceted. I'd like to share with you a couple of stories for some individuals that I've worked with in the past to show you how I've used the Step 2 and how the Step 2 helped them. So let me begin with Beth. Beth has a preference for ENFJ. She reported a probability index of very likely for NFJ and somewhat likely for E. She did verify, however, that her best fit type was for ENFJ. Well, a few months after we did our Step 1 interpretation session, Beth contacted me with a few questions. She asked, sometimes I come across as blunt and questioning. I've been told that I couldn't possibly have a preference for feeling, yet it feels right for me. Why might that be? She also asked, in regard to her preference for extroversion, why do I seem different than my friends who prefer extroversion? Well, this is where the Step 2 makes such a difference. On the Step 2, Beth reports out of preference questioning and tough. She agreed with both of the descriptors. She shared about her childhood, recognizing that both of her parents supported that direct approach. Encouraging questions is a way to understand the world better. For her, there is no doubt her overall preference is for feeling, and our discussion helped her to understand how she may come across differently than other people who prefer feeling. As for extroversion, Beth reported an out of preference for intimate and mid-zone enthusiastic quiet. Although encouraged to ask questions in her childhood, she also came from a large family and found it difficult at times to feel heard. In light of this, she said she spent more time on her own exploring the world in a somewhat more intimate way, learning to enjoy and appreciate time on her own. So this report made sense to her. Beth's individualized type would read like this: intimate, questioning, tough, ENFJ, which would make her different from somebody else with the similar overall preference. Here's another example. I worked with David. Well, David has a preference for ISTJ or ISTP. He is unsure. He reported a somewhat likely preference for P, and I suggested that taking the Step 2 might help him to verify which preference fits best for him. Well, the Step 2 reported this, that he had an out-of-preference planful, mid-zone systematic casual, mid-zone early starting pressure prompted, mid-zone scheduled spontaneous, and lastly, in preference for emergent. And these are the facets for the JP preference pair. Well, he verified each of the facets. Well, why might this be? How did this help him to decide? Well, he described his family as having J-like characteristics, which were encouraged throughout his childhood. He also works in a career where he needs to plan projects ahead of time, but has some flexibility as when to implement them. He said these facets described that side of his current career expectations, and they fit for him. David also mentioned that when he retires, he suspects that these facets will move more toward being in preference for perceiving. So this discussion helped him to verify that indeed he has an overall preference for ISTP. David's individualized type would read like this: he is a planful ISTP. Notice that we don't include the mid-zone results in that individualized type name, only the out-of-preference results. Now, if all the facets were either in preference or mid-zone, then the individualized type would simply read in preference ISTP. And they would likely agree with much of the description for ISTP in the Introduction to Myers-Briggs Type booklet. When working with teams, spend less time defining and explaining the facets and more time on applying them. A feedback session for teams would look like this. It's similar to one-on-one session with some adaptations. Needs more time, at least 4 to 8 hours. You want to check the polarity and probability indexes. Note on the diagram that probability index is highlighted. This is that new way I mentioned of describing preferences when using the global Step 1 assessment. We no longer use PCI, Preference Clarity Index, for those reports. The numbers below the graph reflect the probability indexes as a percent. It is the probability of getting the same results when taking the assessment at another time. The categories are somewhat likely, and very likely to get the same results. Be sure to remove the interpreter summary, and then check each of the categories in advance, because that can help you determine what activities you might want to use, and if you were to set up groups, how you might want to set those up. Well, with the workshop, you want to review Step 1, have them verify, explain the facets and the categories, read in-preference descriptors, and then have participants volunteer to read any mid-zone or out of preference for facets that the group may be interested in. Choose activities based on the needs of the group. Well, what might some of those activities look like? Horseshoe learning tasks work well for teams. The group can be divided into facets with opposites across from each other, regardless of whether it's in or out of preference. And midzone closing the horseshoe or the U shape. Here are some examples of learning tasks that you can use with teams. For extroversion introversion, imagine attending a non-work party with 50 guests. You know the hosts and 5 others. How many people do you interact with, and when do you leave? Have initiating, receiving facets respond and read the descriptors, noticing what those differences are, whether you are in or out of preference or midzone. Or you can ask, how do you like to communicate with others? And how do you like them to communicate with you? You could use the facet active reflective to elicit responses. Perhaps you want to look at sensing intuition. Here, show an image for 30 seconds and ask the team to describe what they saw. You could do something concrete or abstract. Once they answer, have them read their descriptors, or ask the group to respond to this question. What kind of information do you trust? You can ask for responses based on the facet experiential, theoretical, and again, have the team read their descriptors out loud. With thinking, feeling, take the team through a current or recent decision they need to make or have made. Work through the decision-making process using the facets to guide the discussion. Ask the team members to read their descriptors and ask if that fits for their understanding of themselves. You could also combine sensing intuition and thinking feeling, how we take in information and make decisions, and have clients walk through a recent decision using their facet results as an outline. Page 12 of the interpretive report is a great guide for this. What if you're interested in looking at the JP preference pair? Using the pressure-prompted early starting facet, ask each group, what do you like about your facet results? What are your challenges in working with people on the opposite side? Depending upon the team's needs, learning tasks may vary. You can choose to do some of these or all of them. Time, of course, will be a factor. But most important of all is to follow up with an action plan. What are the similarities and differences between team members? What will we do differently to meet the needs of all team members? How will we do it? And when will we follow up to see if it's working? Well, here's a couple success stories that I found in working with teams. The first bullet, understanding differences, looking at personality clashes between similar types. When 2 or more people on a team share the same type, yet they clearly show differences in behaviors, misunderstanding and bias may arise. The Step 2 results can help clarify and identify where those differences show up. The individuality of their personality. This enhances the credibility of the MBTI assessment by pointing out observable behaviors that team members easily recognize. And it does so with a non-judgmental framework. Second bullet, dealing with deadlines. This is looking at that pressure-prompted or early starting facet. For example, I worked with a team where 4 out of 5 team members were pressure-prompted. It was the administrative assistant who was early starting. The team's habitual last-minute pushes to make a deadline created tremendous stress with the administrative assistant. Since a pressure-prompted approach was natural for the others, they simply thought that she was incompetent or lazy and could not keep up. The Step 2 information gave them an entirely new perspective, and they readily agreed to negotiate more reasonable deadlines so that she could have the time needed to complete her responsibilities in a way that worked for her. We can also look at conflict. Often tough and tender facet influences conflict within a team. For example, budget cuts can wreak havoc on an organization. Members of a team in a nonprofit organization who were invested in their many programs were told that some of them needed to be cut. The tough team members specified directly what to cut and came across as uncaring, even though that wasn't their intention. The tender team members were wearing themselves out trying to keep all the programs up and running, putting in extra hours. The mid-zone team members, like the tender team, tried to keep things going until they'd had enough. And enough is enough, and they quickly jumped to the tough side, shocking their colleagues with their abruptness. The Step 2 helped the team recognize their different approaches, and they were able to compromise. Step 2 results can help move a team forward by providing more information about individual differences members observe in each other, revealing how these differences make sense and how the team can capitalize on them. Well, where does that leave you with resources? How can we help you? These following resources are invaluable in working with the Step 2. We have the Step 2 manual. We have a new global Step 1 and Step 2 manual that combines both. We have the Step 2 user's guide. We have understanding your Step 2 results. There is also a facilitation kit introducing the MBTI Step 2 that you can get that includes facilitation notes, scripts, PowerPoint, workshop slides. We also have Step 2 feedback cards, and there is a feedback session video so that you can see how the Step 2 is used. Well, that wraps up your Boost Your Value proposition with the MBTI Step 2 assessment webinar. What questions do you have before we bring this session to a close?
Thank you very much, Iman. I have a set of really great questions here for you. Let's get started. The first one comes from Jeanette, and she asks, let's see here, she submitted multiple questions, and there's a recurring theme here with regards to Step 1 and Step 2 in sessions. She asks, would you split the Step 1 intro session from the Step 2?
All right, yeah, that's a great question. And this could be a personal choice, but I will share my choice with you. I prefer to do a Step 1 session first. I like to give people the time to absorb that information and work with their preference pairs, for some time, even if it's just for a few weeks, but just so that they can get comfortable with the language and understanding their overall preferences. Then I would come back and I would run a Step 2 session with them. However, I would have them take the Step 2 assessment. In fact, I use that assessment for everyone because I can generate from that Step 1 and Step 2 results. Now, you can combine it. It will require much more time, and I guess it will depend on who you're working with and how easily you think they will grasp that material. So the key is to make sure that you go through Step 1 first and get that verified best fit type, because that will determine how the Step 2 results are described. But like I said, personally, I like to split them and spend a little bit of time giving them time to absorb the Step 1 results.
Excellent. Thank you, Iman. The next question comes from Dan. He was specifically referring to the section when you were covering individuals and teams. He asks, do we have the ability to aggregate these powerful individual scores to see an overall team more deeply?
Yes, we actually do. You can actually order them through the Myers-Briggs company as well. And I don't want to get too much into a new aspect known as types. However, I encourage you to explore the Myers-Briggs website for more information on that. You can actually get flip chart pages that have the facets listed in that graph-like format. And one activity that I've used in the past is where I would give each team member a certain color marker, or have each person pick a different color, and then just hang up the flip chart page and have them put their initial where their facet results are. And then that way you get an overview of just looking at that sheet to see exactly where the whole team fits, as well as it gives them the opportunity. And when they see that, they are easily jump right into analyzing mode, and it begins to make sense for them. You can go into greater depth, as I mentioned, with something called the typies, but that's for another webinar, but I do suggest that you explore that. I hope that answered that for you.
Great. Thank you, Yvonne. The next question comes from Sandy. Sandy asks, the suggested wording seems to be, quote, not all aspects of the type letter are represented in the facets, end quote. So any insight into the aspects that determine a letter that are important enough that they can pull the letter to the side that causes a majority of the facets to be, quote, out of preference, end quote.
Okay, that's a really long question.
It is.
Hopefully I will have picked up enough of it, so let me try to run with this. So as I mentioned, that each preference pair is multifaceted. So how do we determine which facets are used with the assessment? This is based on the work of Myers collecting data over the years and noticing that certain behaviors cluster in certain ways. And the items on the assessment are written to pull that out, to draw that information out. However, these are, and perhaps down the road and in the future, we will come up with more facets that we're able to find items to help us pull out. But for right now, this is what we have that we find works and works very well. So that explains how we would have more facets than what we list, because we are multifaceted people. And I'm trying to remember what the second half of that was, Larry.
It was any insights into aspects that determine a letter that are important enough that they can pull the letter to the side that causes a majority of the facets to be out of preference.
Okay, this one, Larry, I may want to get this one in writing, just
sure.
Trying to follow
Absolutely.
Your language, your wording, and then I would be happy to respond to that and send that out to the group. I'm just not quite following what the question is asking.
Absolutely. Another question, Yvonne, is, and it's from Renee, and she qualifies it as, this may be a question for another session, but I was wondering ideas for short topics for group workshops to generate business clients seeking more in-depth assessments and development. Any resources to see intro topic ideas?
Okay, thank you. What kind of ideas, topics to introduce and bring this material to teams and organizations? First off, the interpretive report itself, when you look at the detail that comes with that, those last pages, the application pages where it looks at communication styles, conflict management, dealing with change. I mean, each one of those can be a topic in and of its own. So if a company, for example, is going through a major change in the organization, then that might be one area that I would offer to come in to talk about, based on the Step 2 results, how people might be reacting to that change. There's also several of the Introduction to Type workbooks where it looks at, or booklets, where it looks at things such as Introduction to Type and Teams, Introduction to Type and Leadership, and each of those booklets are also invaluable with giving you ideas and different ways to approach a session with a team. And some of it, honestly, comes from just sitting down and talking with the team manager or the person who wants to bring you in, because each team has different needs. And once I sit down with them and we just start asking questions, I sometimes will be able to just think of the facets themselves and figure out, I think this is an area that we need to look at. And that will come with experience. So don't stress. I mean, the more you do this, the easier this will all come to you.
That's fantastic, Yvonne, and you just reminded me of something. So just to facilitate that experience, to grease those wheels, we have some exercises specific to the MBTI Step II assessment that we will, for everyone attending today's webinar, we will send out following, in addition to the recorded webinar and in addition to a copy of the slides, we will send out a brief survey gauging the effectiveness and the quality of the webinar. And by completing that survey, we will share out their 4 separate MBTI Step II exercises, and we will share those out to everyone that completes that survey.
Great, thank you, Larry. And just to add to that, when you replay, I know it's hard with listening to me talk and explain things without having a visual for some people, including myself. I described a few different exercises. I went through them rather quickly, but when you review and go back over the webinar, I hope that you will be able to pull something out of that as well.
Excellent. And we have time for one more question, and it's actually a clarification from Sandy. She's simply stating her question is about explaining to a client why their letter is opposite of the majority of their facets.
Oh, interesting. Okay, that's a great question. Because there are, in some cases, it's rare, but it can happen that a person will have an overall preference for sensing, but all of their facets be in intuition. And that can happen. That is not indicative of an issue or a problem, because remember, we are multifaceted. Those are just 5 of aspects of who we are and that overall preference. So that can happen. And what you will find when you see that on a report, for me, immediately, my questions that come up would be, first off, does this fit for you? And then, can you give me an example of how you use this or why that might be? And they often can immediately bring up a situation in their lives, because keep in mind, the facets are learned behaviors. So according to type theory, our overall type preferences don't change, but our facets can, because they are environmentally influenced. So depending on our work environment, perhaps our home environment, we can fluctuate then within the facets themselves. And so that is not unusual and would not be anything to be concerned with. I simply would ask them to share examples with me and ask if it fits for them. That's the best way to start.
Thank you, Yvonne. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you all for attending and asking so many excellent questions. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.